The sun hung low over Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and marble monuments. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in September when groundskeeper Marcus Rivera noticed something unusual near the Great Mausoleum. A slight depression had formed in the earth near one of the most visited sites in the entire cemetery, the resting place of Michael Jackson, the king of pop himself. Marcus had worked at Forest Lawn for nearly 15 years. He'd seen everything from celebrity funerals to obsessed fans trying to scale the walls at midnight. But this was different. The ground near Jackson's memorial had settled overnight, creating a small crater about 3 feet wide. It wasn't natural settling. Something beneath the surface had shifted. He immediately called his supervisor, David Chen, who arrived within 20 minutes. David crouched down, examining the depression with growing concern. The soil looked disturbed, almost as if it had been excavated from below rather than collapsed from above. They both knew that Jackson wasn't actually buried in the ground. His body rested in a climate-controlled crypt inside the Holy Terror section of the mausoleum. So what could be causing this disturbance just 30 feet away? David made the call to cemetery management, and by noon, a small team had assembled. They included structural engineers, cemetery officials, and representatives from the Jackson estate. Everyone agreed they needed to investigate before the ground collapsed further and potentially damage the surrounding structures. The Jackson family was notified immediately, and though they were initially hesitant, they understood the necessity of the excavation. By Wednesday morning, a small construction crew had cordoned off the area with white privacy screens. They told visitors it was routine maintenance, but word was already spreading on social media. Fans began gathering outside the cemetery gates, their phones raised, trying to capture any glimpse of what was happening. The crew began carefully removing soil, layer by layer, documenting everything with photographs and measurements. 3 feet down, they hit something solid. It wasn't bedrock or utility line. It was metal, specifically what appeared to be the corner of a large steel container. The foreman, a weathered man named Robert Sullivan, had excavated hundreds of sites in his 40-year career. He'd never seen anything like this. The metal was clean, almost new-looking, despite being buried beneath tons of earth. It bore no markings, no identifying features, just smooth stainless steel that gleamed when they brushed away the date. The team worked methodically through the afternoon, exposing more of the container. It measured roughly 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet deep, about the size of a large coffin, though the shape was more rectangular, like a storage vault. It had been positioned deliberately, not randomly buried. Someone had gone to considerable effort to place this here, and recently too. The soil above it showed signs of careful replacement, suggesting the burial had occurred within the past few years. By Thursday, they'd fully exposed the container and rigged a crane to lift it. The Jackson family had sent their lawyer, Patricia Blackwell, to oversee the opening. She was a stern woman in her 60s who'd represented the family's interests for over 2 decades. She insisted everything be documented and that a family representative be present when the vault was opened. Michael's nephew, Marcus Jackson Jr., arrived that afternoon, his face gray with concern and curiosity. They moved the container to a secure facility on the cemetery grounds, a small building normally used for administrative purposes. The room was cleared of everything except a large table where the vault now rested. Present were Marcus Jr., Patricia, David Chen, a forensic specialist named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and 2 security guards. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Everyone knew that whatever lay inside this vault had been hidden deliberately, buried near Michael Jackson's resting place for a reason. Dr. Mitchell examined the seals carefully. The vault was designed to be watertight and airtight, with industrial-grade gasket around the lid. There was a locking mechanism, but curiously, it wasn't engaged. Whoever had buried this hadn't locked it. They'd wanted it found, eventually, or perhaps they'd been interrupted. Sarah photographed every angle, taking samples of the residue around the seals, documenting the exact position of every element. Finally, the moment arrived. With gloved hands, Dr. Mitchell and her assistant carefully pried open the lid. The seals released with a soft hiss of escaping air. The smell that emerged was unexpected. Not decay or must, but something chemical, like preservatives or photography development fluid. They lifted the lid fully and set it aside. Inside, nestled in custom foam padding, were stacks upon stacks of documents. But these weren't ordinary papers. They were leather-bound journals, thousands of pages of handwritten notes, photographs, some in color, some black and white, and what appeared to be legal documents with official seals. On top of everything lay a single envelope, pristine white, with 2 words written in elegant cursive: the truth. Marcus Jr. reached for the envelope with trembling hands, but Patricia stopped him. They needed to document everything first, she insisted. But even as the cameras clicked and Dr. Mitchell carefully catalogued each item, everyone in that room understood they'd stumbled upon something monumental. These weren't just random documents buried near celebrities' grave. Someone had created an archive, a collection of secrets, and hidden it in the one place they knew the world would never stop watching. Beside Michael Jackson, the most famous entertainer who ever lived. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the secure examination room as Dr. Sarah Mitchell carefully removed the first journal from the vault. The leather cover was supple, expensive, the kind used for important records meant to last decades. She opened it gently, revealing page after page of dense handwriting. The script was elegant but hurried in places, as if the writer had been racing against time to get everything down. Patricia Blackwell leaned forward, her reading glasses catching the light. The first entry was dated June 15th, 2005, just days before Michael Jackson's trial verdict on child molestation charges. But this wasn't Jackson's handwriting. Dr. Mitchell, who'd studied the singer's autographs and signatures for verification purposes, could confirm that immediately this belonged to someone else, someone who'd been intimately involved in Jackson's life during those tumultuous years. Marcus Jr. picked up the white envelope while Patricia examined the journal. His hand shook as he broke the seal and extracted a letter written on thick, expensive stationery. He read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, "To whoever finds this collection, I am Dr. Arnold Kleinberg, personal physician, and friend to Michael Jackson for 17 years. What you're about to discover will shake the foundations of everything the world thinks it knows about his life, his death, and the empire built on his legacy. I buried these documents here because Michael once told me that this memorial would stand for centuries, watched over by millions. He said the truth always finds its way to light, even from the darkest graves. I pray he was right." The room fell silent. Dr. Arnold Kleinberg had died in 2019 from heart failure in Thailand, where he fled after his medical license was revoked following Jackson's death. He'd been vilified in the media, accused of contributing to the singer's prescription drug dependency. Many believed he'd escaped justice by leaving the country. But now, 4 years after Kleinberg's death, his secret archive had literally risen from the ground. Patricia immediately called the Jackson family attorney, while Dr. Mitchell began the painstaking process of cataloging the contents. There were 4 to 7 journals in total, spanning from 2005 to just weeks before Jackson's death in June 2009. Each one was meticulously dated, with entries sometimes occurring multiple times per day. Kleinberg had documented everything: conversations, medical treatments, late-night phone calls, fears Michael had expressed, and most startlingly, names. Dozens of names belonging to powerful people in the entertainment industry, business world, and even politics. The photographs were even more revealing. Tucked between the journal pages were hundreds of images that had never seen public light. They showed Michael with various associates, some smiling for the camera, others courting candid moments of what appeared to be heated discussions. But it was the legal documents that made Patricia's face drain of color. Contracts, agreements, financial records, all suggesting that Jackson's business affairs had been far more complicated and potentially sinister than anyone had realized. One journal entry from November 2006 sent chills through everyone present. Kleinberg had written, "Michael called me at 3 a.m, terrified. He believes someone is trying to take everything from him, his music, his children, his legacy. He is convinced that powerful people want him dead, that is worth more to them as a martyr than as a living artist who controls his own catalog. I tried to calm him, but I'm beginning to wonder if his paranoia is justified. The people around him seem to change every few months, and each new manager or advisor pushes him toward more touring, more debt, more dependency on medications to keep performing at an impossible pace." Marcus Jr. set down the letter he'd been reading and picked up another photograph. It showed his uncle in what appeared to be a hospital room, looking gaunt and exhausted, connected to an info drip. The date stamp on the back read April 2009, just 2 months before his death. Kleinberg's note attached to it stated, "Taken after another collapse during rehearsal. They gave him 20 minutes to recover before demanding he continue. This is not medical care. This is exploitation." The team worked through the night, carefully documenting each piece of evidence. Dr. Mitchell discovered a section of journals dedicated entirely to Jackson's pharmaceutical intake. Kleinberg had meticulously recorded every medication prescribed, by whom, and for what stated purpose. The list was staggering: painkillers, sedatives, anti-anxiety medications, stimulants to counter the sedatives. It painted a picture of a man being chemically managed rather than medically treated. But perhaps most explosive were the financial documents. They revealed a complex web of loans, agreements, and contracts that had effectively trapped Jackson in a cycle of debt despite his immense earning potential. One contract, dated 2007, showed that Jackson had been required to tour extensively to pay off loans taken against his own music catalog. The terms were predatory, with interest rates that would have been illegal in many circumstances. Patricia recognized several signatures on these documents, people who had publicly mourned Jackson's death while privately having profited enormously from it. By Friday morning, Patricia had made several calls to the estate's legal team. They needed to decide how to proceed. The contents of this vault weren't just personal memorabilia. There were potential evidence of fraud, medical malpractice, exploitation, and possibly conspiracy. If even half of what Kleinberg had documented proved true, it would trigger investigations that could reach the highest levels of the entertainment industry. Marcus Jr. found himself drawn to the more personal entries. One from February 2009 described Michael playing with his children in the garden of his rental home, laughing and carefree for a rare afternoon. Kleinberg had written, "Today I saw glimpses of the Michael I first met, joyful, creative, full of wonder. But tonight, when the business managers arrived with papers to sign, that light vanished. He looked at me with such exhaustion and said, 'Arnold, I'm so tired of being everyone's cash machine. When do I get to just be a father?' I had no answer for him." The journals also contained detailed accounts of the preparations for Jackson's comeback tour. This is it. Kleinberg documented concerns about Michael's physical condition, noting that several doctors had advised against the grueling 50-show schedule. But those concerns had been overruled by tour promoters and managers who'd already sold tickets and secured sponsorships. Michael had confided to Kleinberg that he felt trapped, that he couldn't back out without facing financial ruin and legal action. As dawn broke over Forest Lawn, the team gathered around the table, surrounded by evidence that could rewrite history. Dr. Mitchell had created a preliminary inventory, but she estimated it would take weeks to properly analyze everything. Patricia knew they had a decision to make. They could seal this vault again, protect the family from the media storm that would inevitably follow. Or they could expose the truth, whatever consequences it might bring. Marcus Jr. thought about his uncle's legacy, the music that had inspired billions, the humanitarian work, the artistry that transcended culture and generation. But he also thought about the man behind the icon, the one who'd been exploited and betrayed. The truth wouldn't be comfortable, but perhaps it was necessary. The Jackson family conference room at the Haven House estate was filled with tension thick enough to cut. 3 generations of Jackson sat around the mahogany table, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief, anger, and determination. The journals and documents from Kleinberg's vault were spread before them, each revelation more disturbing than the last. Catherine Jackson, the family matriarch now in her 90s, sat at the head of the table, her weathered hands clasped together as she listened to Patricia Blackwell's summary. Michael's siblings, Janet, Randy, Tito, Jackie, and Marlon, had all flown in within hours of learning about the discovery. Paris and Prince Jackson, Michael's children now in their 20s, sat close together, their faces pale. They'd grown up knowing their father had been taken from them too soon, but they'd never fully understood the forces that had surrounded him in those final years. Now, the evidence lay before them in heartbreaking detail. Patricia cleared her throat and began reading from one of the more damning journal entries, dated May 2009. "Michael showed me bruises on his arms today. He claims they're from dance rehearsals, but I'm a physician. I know the difference between performance injuries and physical restraint marks. When I pressed him, he broke down. He told me that when he couldn't remember choreography or needed to stop from exhaustion, handlers would physically force him to continue. His being treated like a puppet, not a person. I've documented this with photographs, though he made me promise never to show anyone while he's alive. He's protecting people who are destroying him. The room erupted. Randy Jackson slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. He'd been the most vocal family member after Michael's death, insisting that his brother had been murdered, not through a single injection of propofol, but through years of systematic abuse and exploitation. Now, he had proof that his suspicions weren't conspiracy theories. They were documented facts. Janet wiped tears from her eyes as she picked up a photograph showing her brother during what appeared to be a contract signing. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and the smile he wore looked painted on. She remembered visiting him during the This Is It rehearsals, how he'd seemed distant and overwhelmed. She'd attributed it to performance anxiety, but now she wondered if he'd been crying out for help in the only way he could, through silence and withdrawal. Dr. Mitchell had accompanied Patricia to the family meeting, bringing her preliminary forensic analysis. She explained that the documents showed a clear pattern of financial manipulation spanning years. Michael's own assets had been leveraged against him, creating debt obligations that required constant touring and recording to maintain. Meanwhile, those managing his affairs collected enormous fees and percentages, profiting whether Michael succeeded or failed. It was a system designed to extract maximum value from him, while giving him minimal control over his own career. But the journals revealed something even more sinister. Kleinberg had documented conversations where Michael expressed fears for his safety. In March 2009, Michael had told his doctor, "They need me alive long enough to sign everything over Arnold. After that, I'm worth more dead. The insurance policies, the posthumous releases, the tribute concerts, it's all worth billions. I've seen the projections. They've shown me the numbers like they are trying to make me comfortable with my own funeral plans." Katherine Jackson spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She'd known her son was struggling. She'd seen him deteriorate physically and emotionally in those final years. But she'd been kept at arm's length by the wall of managers, lawyers, and handlers who controlled access to him. Now she understood that the separation had been deliberate. People who genuinely cared about Michael had been systematically isolated, replaced by those who saw him as a revenue stream rather than a human being. Paris Jackson stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. She was trembling with rage and grief. She'd been just 11 when her father died, and she'd spent the subsequent years dealing with conspiracy theories, public speculation, and her own mental health struggles. Now, reading her father's documented fears and seeing evidence of his suffering, something crystallized within her. This wasn't just about vindication or justice. It was about making sure no other artist could be similarly exploited. Prince, the eldest Jackson child, had been reading through Kleinberg's medical notes. As someone who'd studied film and production, he understood the entertainment industry's mechanics. But seeing it laid out in such stark detail, the calculated manipulation, the chemical dependency fostered to maintain control, the financial engineering that trapped his father in golden handcuffs, made him physically ill. He'd thought he'd processed his grief years ago. This felt like losing his father all over again, but with the added horror of understanding what he'd endured. Patricia presented the family with their options. They could take this evidence to law enforcement and trigger criminal investigations. The statute of limitations had expired on many potential charges, but civil suits could still be filed. More importantly, this evidence could lead to industry-wide reforms regarding artist contracts, medical ethics in entertainment, and the duty of care owed to performers. However, going public would mean subjecting the family to intense media scrutiny. Every detail will be dissected, debated, and potentially twisted by those with vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Alternatively, they could work with the estate to quietly resolve matters, using the evidence as leverage to renegotiate contracts and reclaim assets that had been unfairly obtained. This approach would protect the family's privacy but might allow guilty parties to escape public accountability. It was a choice between justice and peace, and there was no perfect answer. Randy argued passionately for full disclosure. His brother had been vilified, his reputation tarnished by accusations and speculation. This evidence proved that Michael had been a victim, not a perpetrator, a man destroyed by the very system that claimed to celebrate him. The world deserved to know the truth, and those responsible deserved to be exposed, regardless of how powerful they become. Janet took a more measured approach. She worried about her niece and nephews, how this revelation would affect them. They'd finally found some stability in their lives. Reopening these wounds publicly could undo years of healing. She also worried about Michael's legacy. Would the truth tarnish the joy his music had brought billions, or would it finally allow people to see him as he truly was? A gifted artist who'd been exploited and betrayed? As the family debated, Dr. Mitchell revealed another finding that silenced everyone. Kleinberg's final journal entries, written just days before Michael's death, suggested the doctor had tried to intervene. He'd contacted several family members and colleagues, warning them that Michael's life was in immediate danger. He'd documented his attempts to convince Michael to cancel the tour and enter proper rehabilitation. But his warnings had been ignored or dismissed. In his last entry, dated June 23, 2009, 2 days before Michael's death, Kleinberg wrote, "I've failed him. I've documented everything, but documentation doesn't save lives. If something happens to Michael, I want the world to know it wasn't accident or addiction. It was murder by exploitation, and I couldn't stop it." The weight of those words hung heavy in the room. Kleinberg had known. He'd seen what was coming and had tried to prevent it. His exile to Thailand, his revoked medical license, his death far from home. Perhaps they hadn't been about escaping justice, but about escaping guilt. He'd been a witness to a slow-motion tragedy, and the burden had consumed him. Katherine Jackson finally stood, her age frame still carrying the dignity that had sustained her through decades of public scrutiny. She looked at each family member, then at the mountains of evidence surrounding them. Her decision would guide them all, and everyone waited for her to speak. The law offices of Morrison, Black, and Associates occupied 3 floors of a Century City high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Los Angeles. It was here, in a secure conference room sealed from electronic surveillance, that the Jackson family's legal team assembled to review Kleinberg's evidence and plot their strategy. Joining Patricia Blackwell were Harold Morrison, senior partner and entertainment law specialist, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a forensic accountant, Marcus Webb, a former FBI agent now working as a private investigator, and David Reyes, a criminal defense attorney with prosecutorial experience. The team had spent 10 days systematically analyzing every document, cross-referencing names, dates, and financial transactions. What emerged was a picture so disturbing that even these seasoned professionals found themselves shocked by the scope of the exploitation. Dr. Chen had traced financial flows through dozens of shell companies, offshore accounts, and complex loan structures. The numbers were staggering. Between 2005 and 2009, over $300 million had flowed through Michael Jackson's accounts, yet he died nearly $500 million in debt. Where had the money gone? The forensic accounting revealed that management fees, interest on predatory loans, and costs associated with canceled projects had consumed the vast majority of Jackson's earnings. But more troubling were the payments to individuals and entities that had no clear business relationship with Jackson. Dr. Chen had identified nearly $40 million in unexplained transfers, many occurring in the months before his death. These payments suggested either blackmail, bribes, or kickbacks, all of which warranted criminal investigation. Marcus Webb had focused on the individuals named in Kleinberg's journals. Many had gone on to highly successful careers in entertainment management and production. Several now held executive positions at major record labels and concert promotion companies. A few had become wealthy beyond imagination, building empires on their reputations as successful artist managers. But Webb's investigation revealed a pattern. Multiple artists who'd worked with these same individuals had died young or suffered career-ending breakdowns. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Harold Morrison laid out the legal landscape. Civil suits could target specific individuals and companies for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and wrongful death. However, proving causation would be challenging. Yes, Michael had been exploited and mistreated, but connecting that directly to his death would require establishing that the defendant's actions proximately caused Dr. Conrad Murray to administer the fatal dose of propofol. That was a high bar to clear. Murray had already been convicted of involuntary manslaughter and served his sentence. Prosecutors might be reluctant to revisit the case without overwhelming new evidence. Criminal charges were even more complex. The statute of limitations had expired for most financial crimes. However, if they could prove ongoing conspiracy or establish that the exploitation constituted racketeering, federal RICO statutes might apply. David Reyes cautioned that this was an aggressive legal theory that would face significant challenges. But if successful, it could expose an entire system of artist exploitation that extended far beyond Michael Jackson. As the legal team debated strategies, Paris and Prince Jackson sat in an adjacent office, reviewing materials their father had left behind: letters, voice recordings, video diaries. Michael had documented his own experiences, though less systematically than Kleinberg. In a video recorded on his phone just weeks before his death, Michael sat on his bed at the Carrollwood mansion, looking directly at the camera with exhausted eyes. "I don't know if I'm going to survive this," he said softly. "The schedule is impossible. My body can't take it anymore. But they don't care. I'm not a person to them. I'm a product, a brand, a revenue stream. If I cancel, they sue me for everything. If I continue, I might die on stage. Either way, they win." He paused, rubbing his face. "I just want my kids to know that I tried. I tried to be strong enough for everyone. I tried to make the music, pay the bills, satisfy the demands. But I'm just one person, and they're an army." Paris had to pause the video, her hand shaking too much to hold the tablet steady. Prince put his arm around his sister's shoulders, both of them crying silently. They'd known their father loved them, but seeing his vulnerability, his awareness of the trap he was in, made their loss even more profound. He'd been fighting a battle they'd been too young to understand, and he'd lost. Back in the main conference room, the team had received a visitor. Thomas Brighton, a journalist with the New York Times who had covered the entertainment industry for 30 years, had been quietly investigating the circumstances of Jackson's death for years. He'd heard rumors about Kleinberg's archive and had reached out through Patricia's office. Morrison was initially reluctant to meet with press, but Brighton had brought something valuable: corroborating evidence. Brighton had spent years interviewing people in Jackson's orbit: backup dancers, crew members, personal assistants, bodyguards. Many had been bound by non-disclosure agreements and fears of industry blacklisting, but time and distance had loosened some tongues. He'd documented accounts of Michael collapsing during rehearsals, being injected with substances to keep him performing, and expressing fears about his safety. Brighton had witnesses willing to testify, though many still feared retaliation. "The entertainment industry has a dark secret," Brighton explained, spreading his own files across the table. What happened to Michael Jackson wasn't unique. It's a logical endpoint of a system that values profit over people. Artists are developed, exploited until they break, then discarded. The lucky ones escape. The unlucky ones die. And because we worship celebrity, we blame the victims for their own destruction. Drug addiction, mental illness, suicide. We treat these as personal failures rather than symptoms of systematic abuse. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. Her analysis had revealed similar patterns in the financial arrangements of other deceased artists. The contracts were designed to be inescapable. Artists borrowed against future earnings to maintain lifestyles expected of celebrities, then were forced to work constantly to service the debt. The managers and executives who crafted these arrangements faced no risk. They collected fees whether the artist succeeded or burned out. It was a system engineered for exploitation. Patricia asked the question everyone was thinking. If they exposed this system, could they actually change it? Or would powerful interests simply close ranks, discredit the evidence, and continue as before? Brighton was honest. Bringing down an entire industry was unlikely, but exposing specific individuals and practices might save the next generation of artists. It might make young performers think twice before signing predatory contracts. It might embolden whistleblowers to come forward with their own stories. The strategy began to crystallize. They would pursue a multi-pronged approach. Civil suits against specific individuals and companies would seek financial compensation and public accountability. Simultaneously, they'd work with federal prosecutors to investigate potential RICO violations and financial crimes that might still be actionable. Brighton would publish a comprehensive investigative series in the Times, using Kleinberg's archives as primary source material while protecting legally sensitive information. Most importantly, they'd use this moment to push for industry reform. The Jackson family would work with legislators to introduce the Artist Protection Act, legislation that would mandate independent medical oversight for touring performers, limit predatory lending against artists' catalogs, and establish fiduciary duties for managers. It wouldn't bring Michael back, but it might prevent future tragedies. As the meeting concluded and evening fell over Los Angeles, Prince and Paris rejoined the group. They'd made their decision. Whatever the personal cost, whatever media scrutiny they faced, they wanted the truth exposed. Their father had been silenced in life by those who profited from him. In death, his story would finally be heard. 6 months after the discovery of Kleinberg's vault, the world had changed for the Jackson family and the entertainment industry. The New York Times investigative series, The Price of Stardom, How Michael Jackson Was Destroyed, had run as a 6-part expose that dominated headlines for weeks. Thomas Brighton's meticulous reporting, backed by Kleinberg's documentation, had sparked congressional hearings, multiple lawsuits, and a cultural reckoning about how the industry treated its artists. The initial public reaction had been explosive and polarizing. Jackson's most devoted fans felt vindicated. Their years of insisting he'd been murdered by the industry were now supported by documented evidence. Skeptics questioned the timing and authenticity, suggesting the family was trying to rewrite history for financial gain. But as more corroborating witnesses came forward and forensic experts verified the document's authenticity, the narrative shifted. This wasn't conspiracy theory. It was documented fact. 3 former executives named in Kleinberg journals had been indicted on federal fraud charges. Dr. Elizabeth Chen Forensic Accounting had traced illicit financial flows with such precision that prosecutors felt confident pursuing criminal cases despite the passage of time. The theory they presented was bold. These individuals had operated a criminal enterprise that systematically exploited artists, with Michael Jackson as their primary victim. They created fraudulent loan documents, embezzled funds through shell companies, and conspired to maintain control over Jackson even as his health deteriorated. The civil suits had been even more extensive. The Jackson estate, representing Michael's children as primary beneficiaries, had filed wrongful death and fraud claims totaling over $2 billion against individuals, companies, and insurers. The legal arguments were complex, but the core assertion was straightforward. Michael Jackson had been intentionally placed in circumstances that made his death probable, if not inevitable, because he was worth more dead than alive. The insurance policies, posthumous album releases, and hologram tours that followed his death had generated astronomical profits for everyone except his heirs. Paris Jackson had become the public face of the campaign for industry reform. At 26, she transformed from a troubled young woman struggling with her father's legacy into a passionate advocate for artists' rights. She testified before Congress about growing up knowing her father had been destroyed by people he trusted. Her testimony was raw, emotional, and devastatingly effective. Video of her statement went viral, sparking conversations about exploitation in creative industries worldwide. "My father was the greatest entertainer who ever lived," she told a congressional committee, her voice steady despite visible emotion. But that's all they saw him as, entertainment. Not a human being with limits, needs, or rights. Just a product to be used until it broke. I don't want his death to be meaningless. If we can change the system, if we can protect even one artist from the same fate, then maybe we can find purpose in this tragedy. Prince Jackson had taken a different approach. He'd partnered with documentary filmmakers to create a comprehensive film about his father's final years, using Kleinberg's materials, family archives, and new interviews with witnesses who'd remained silent for years. The Man Behind the Mask, Michael Jackson's final act, premiered at Sundance to critical acclaim, and was subsequently acquired by a major streaming service. It wasn't a hagiography. It honestly addressed Michael's struggles with prescription medications and his complicated relationships. But it contextualized these issues within a system designed to exploit vulnerability rather than support recovery. The documentary included devastating footage of Michael during This Is It rehearsals that had never been included in the official film. Viewers saw him collapse from exhaustion, heard him beg for breaks that were denied, watched as handlers pressured him to continue despite obvious distress. It was difficult to watch, but it demolished the narrative that Michael's death had been solely about his personal demons. The demons had been deliberately cultivated and sustained by people who profited from his inability to say no. Katherine Jackson had lived to see her son's vindication, though the toll had been enormous. At 9 to 5, she'd sat through depositions, reviewed painful evidence, and relived the trauma of losing her child. But she'd also seen the industry begin to change. Multiple record labels had revised their standard contracts, eliminating some of the most predatory clauses. Concert promoters had implemented mandatory health screenings and rest requirements for touring artists. It wasn't enough, but it was progress. The Artist Protection Act had been signed into law in a bipartisan ceremony at the White House. The legislation required independent medical oversight for major tours, mandated cooling-off period for major contract signings, established fiduciary responsibility for managers, and created a compensation fund for artists who could prove exploitation under previous arrangements. It was historic legislation, though critics argued it didn't go far enough in addressing systemic issues. Marcus Webb's investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing in the final months of the legal process. He'd traced connections between several individuals in Jackson's orbit and organized crime figures involved in entertainment industry financing. The Las Vegas connections, the offshore accounts, the pattern of intimidation witnesses had described, it all pointed to deep corruption that extended far beyond typical business malfeasance. Federal prosecutors were now investigating whether Michael Jackson had been caught in a web of organized criminal activity, a puppet for forces far more dangerous than greedy executives. On a warm June afternoon, 15 years the day after Michael Jackson's death, the family gathered at Forest Lawn for a private ceremony. The area where Kleinberg's vault had been discovered now featured a simple bronze plaque. It read, "Truth, like love, finds its way home," in memory of Dr. Arnold Kleinberg, who had the courage to document what others chose to ignore. Paris stood before her father's crypt, holding a letter she'd written but would never send. In it, she'd told him about everything that had happened, the discovery, the investigations, the changes they'd fought for in his name. She'd told him that she finally understood the weight he carried, the impossible position he'd been placed in, the love that had driven him to sacrifice himself for his children's future. She'd promised him that his suffering wouldn't be forgotten or repeated. Prince had brought his own children, Catherine and Michael Jr., Michael's grandchildren who'd never met him. He told them stories about their grandfather, not the king of pop, but the man who'd made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse and performed magic tricks at bedtime. He wanted them to know the person, not just a legend, to understand that behind every public figure is a human being deserving of protection and dignity. The legal battles would continue for years. Appeals would be filed, settlements negotiated, and new evidence would emerge. But the essential truth had been established and could never be erased. Michael Jackson hadn't self-destructed. He'd been systematically destroyed by people who saw his genius as an asset to be exploited rather than a gift to be protected. Around the world, the impact continued to ripple outward. Young artists reading about Jackson's fate began asking harder questions about their own contracts. Industry veterans who'd witnessed similar exploitation found courage to speak out. Music schools incorporated artist rights and business ethics into their curricula. The conversation had fundamentally shifted from why couldn't Michael save himself to why did the system fail to protect him. As sunset painted the sky orange and purple over Forest Lawn, the Jackson family stood together in silence. They'd spent 15 years with questions and 5 years fighting for answers. The truth hadn't brought Michael back, hadn't erased the pain of loss, hadn't fixed everything that was broken, but it had given his death meaning beyond tragedy. It had transformed their grief into purpose. Janet Jackson placed a single white rose at the base of her brother's memorial. She thought about the little boy who performed with such joy on talent shows, the young man who'd changed music forever with Thriller, the father who'd loved his children more than anything in the world. She thought about how that beautiful, complicated person had been chewed up by an industry that claimed to celebrate him. "We did it, Michael," she whispered. "We told your truth. Rest now." As darkness fell and the family departed, security guards resumed their normal patrols. But Forest Lawn felt different somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted. In the mausoleum, Michael Jackson's physical remains rested undisturbed, as they had for 15 years. But the secrets buried beside him had risen into light, transforming silence into testimony, darkness into dawn. The vault beneath Forest Lawn had held more than documents. It had contained truth powerful enough to shake an empire, compassion deep enough to survive death, and love strong enough to demand justice. What they'd found under Michael Jackson's grave hadn't just changed everything about his legacy. It had changed everything about how the world understood the price of fame itself. In the months that followed, the reverberations continued to spread through the entertainment industry like seismic waves. The first major trial, Jackson Estate v. Matheson Entertainment Group, went to court in downtown Los Angeles. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists, industry insiders, and members of the public who'd lined up for hours to witness history being made. Thomas Matheson, once lauded as one of the most successful concert promoters in the world, now sat at the defense table looking diminished and gray. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented Kleinberg's journals chronologically, walking the jury through 4 years of escalating exploitation. Dr. Chen testified for 3 days, using charts and financial records to demonstrate how Matheson's company had structured loans designed to trap Jackson in an endless cycle of touring. Email evidence showed executives celebrating privately when Jackson's attempt to cancel shows were blocked by contractual penalties. But the moment that broke the case wide open came when Marcus represented phone records he'd obtained through federal subpoena. They showed that in the 72 hours before Michael Jackson's death, executives at Matheson Entertainment had been in contact with Dr. Conrad Murray 15 times. The calls lasted anywhere from 2 minutes to 27 minutes. Murray had never disclosed these communications during his criminal trial. When prosecutors confronted him in prison with this evidence, he'd finally talked. Murray's deposition was played in court, and the revelations were stunning. He admitted that Matheson executives had pressured him to keep Jackson functional for rehearsals by any means necessary. They'd implied that if the tour was canceled due to Jackson's health, Murray would be held financially liable through clauses in his employment contract. They'd suggested medications, dosages, and treatment protocols despite having no medical training. Murray had been installed not as Jackson's physician, but as a tour's insurance policy, a medical professional willing to prioritize the show over the patient. "I was wrong," Murray said in the video deposition, his voice hollow. "I violated every oath I took as a doctor. But they made it clear that if Michael couldn't perform, I wouldn't just lose my job, I'd lose everything. They'd sue me for breach of contract, destroy my reputation, and make sure I never practiced medicine again. So I gave him what he needed to keep going, even when I knew it was dangerous. I told myself I was helping him achieve his dreams, but I was helping them extract the last profitable moments from his life." The jury deliberated for 11 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Matheson Entertainment Group was liable for fraud, wrongful death, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages awarded were staggering: $400 million in compensatory damages and $1.2 billion in punitive damages. It was one of the largest wrongful death verdicts in entertainment history. Matheson Entertainment filed for bankruptcy within weeks, its assets frozen pending appeals. But money was only part of the story. The trial had exposed internal documents showing that the This Is It tour had been conceived not as Michael's comeback, but as a desperate attempt to generate revenue before his death. Insurance actuaries had calculated his life expectancy based on his medical history and concluded that a 50-show tour was extremely high risk for performer mortality. Executives had purchased comprehensive insurance policies covering tour cancellation due to death or disability. They'd literally bet on Michael Jackson dying, and they'd won that bet to the tune of billions in posthumous earnings. Similar lawsuits were filed against other defendants named in Kleinberg's materials. Most settled confidentially rather than face public trials, but the settlement amounts leaked anyway. Over $3 billion was ultimately recovered and placed in trust for Paris, Prince, and Blanket Jackson. But more significantly, the settlements required defendants to cooperate with ongoing criminal investigations and to support industry reform efforts. The congressional hearings that followed were extraordinary. Committee members from both parties united in outrage as they heard testimony from artists, managers, medical professionals, and industry experts. Beyoncé testified about the pressure to perform while injured. Elton John spoke about watching friends destroyed by exploitative contracts. Younger artists like Billie Eilish discussed how fear of becoming the next Michael Jackson had influenced their career decisions. The hearings revealed that Jackson's case, while extreme, represented a broader pattern. Multiple artists had died or suffered severe health crises while under similar contractual obligations. Amy Winehouse, Whitney Houston, Prince, while each case had unique circumstances, all shared common elements of exploitative contracts, inadequate medical care, and handlers who prioritized profit over well-being. The system hadn't just failed Michael Jackson. It had been failing artists for decades. Dr. Mitchell, who'd authenticated Kleinberg's archive, was called to testify about the medical evidence. She explained how the journals documented a textbook case of what psychiatrists call complex exploitation trauma. Michael Jackson had been systematically isolated from support systems, made financially dependent on his exploiters, and chemically managed to maintain productivity. The psychological impact had been profound: paranoia, anxiety, insomnia, all of which had been treated with more medications rather than by addressing the underlying abuse. What happened to Michael Jackson would be recognized as severe abuse if it occurred in any other context, Dr. Mitchell testified. If a spouse controlled their partner this way, we'd call it domestic violence. If a parent treated a child this way, we'd call it abuse and neglect. But because it happened in the entertainment industry, we called it business as usual. We blamed the victim for being difficult or addicted when he was actually responding rationally to an impossible situation. The Artist Protection Act that emerged from these hearings was more comprehensive than initial proposals. It established mandatory rest periods for touring performers, no more than 4 consecutive show days without a break. It required independent medical professionals, not employed by tour promoters, to certify an artist's fitness to perform. It created fiduciary responsibilities for managers, making them legally accountable for prioritizing their clients' interests. It established whistleblower protections for anyone reporting artist abuse or exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, it created the Artist Advocacy Board, an independent federal agency empowered to investigate exploitation complaints, audit contracts, and sanction bad actors. The board would be staffed by former artists, medical professionals, legal experts, and labor advocates. For the first time, there would be governmental oversight of an industry that had operated in a largely unregulated Wild West for decades. The cultural impact extended beyond legislation. Major universities launched programs studying the ethics of entertainment management. Medical schools added coursework on treating high-profile patients and resisting external pressure. Law schools examined case studies of exploitative contracts. The Jackson case became a touchstone for discussions about capitalism, celebrity, and human dignity. Paris Jackson's advocacy work expanded internationally. She'd founded the Michael Jackson Artist Protection Foundation, which provided free legal services to emerging artists and educated young performers about predatory practices. The foundation had intervened in dozens of cases, helping artists escape abusive contracts and seek medical treatment. Paris spoke regularly at music schools and industry events, sharing her father's story and urging systemic change. "My father's greatest gift was his music," she told audiences. But his greatest legacy might be the changes his death has finally inspired. Every artist who now gets proper medical care on tour, every young performer who avoids signing a predatory contract, every manager who thinks twice about exploiting their client, they're all beneficiaries of the truth we fought to expose. My father's suffering wasn't meaningless. We've made sure of that. Prince Jackson had taken a different path, but one equally meaningful. His documentary work had expanded into a broader examination of exploitation in creative industries. He produced films about visual artists, writers, and actors who'd faced similar abuse. His production company, Legacy Films, was committed to telling stories about the human cost of fame and the need for systemic reform. The impact on the music industry was tangible and immediate. Several major record labels had restructured their artist relations departments, hiring medical liaisons and wellness coordinators. Concert promoters had implemented comprehensive performer protection policies. Insurance companies now required independent medical assessments before covering major tours. The changes weren't perfect or universal, but they represented genuine progress. On the criminal front, federal prosecutors had secured convictions or guilty pleas from 7 individuals on charges ranging from fraud to racketeering. The RICO case that David Reyes had considered ambitious had proven successful, with prosecutors demonstrating a pattern of criminal enterprise spanning multiple artists and decades. The sentences ranged from probation to 15 years in federal prison. Thomas Methson himself had been sentenced to 12 years after being convicted on 14 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. During his sentencing hearing, he'd addressed the court with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "I told myself I was helping Michael achieve his dreams. I convinced myself that what we were doing was normal, that all artists were managed this way. But reading Dr. Kleinberg's journals, seeing the fear and exhaustion in Michael's own words, I can't hide from the truth anymore. We didn't manage an artist. We consumed a human being. The judge had responded coldly. Mr. Matheson, you didn't just exploit Michael Jackson's talent. You exploited his goodness, his desire to please, his love for his children, and his financial desperation that you helped create. You treated him as a commodity until he broke, then profited even more from his death. This court hopes your sentence sends a message that such conduct will not be tolerated, no matter how profitable it might be. As the 5th anniversary of the vault discovery approached, the Jackson family gathered once again at Forest Lawn. This time, they weren't alone. Dozens of artists, industry professionals, and advocates joined them for the unveiling of a new memorial, not just to Michael, but to all artists who'd been exploited or destroyed by the industry. The memorial featured bronze sculpture of hands reaching upward toward light, with the inscription, "In memory of the artists we lost, and in hope for those we can save." The ceremony featured speeches from musicians, actors, and athletes who'd faced their own battles with exploitation. Lady Gaga spoke about her early career struggles and how Jackson's story had helped her recognize and resist similar patterns. Rihanna discussed building her own business empire specifically to maintain control over her art and image. Kendrick Lamar performed an emotional tribute song he'd written about Jackson's legacy. But the most powerful moment came when Prince Jackson introduced a surprise guest, Arnold Kleinberg's daughter, Rachel, who'd flown in from Thailand where she'd been caring for her father during his final years. She was in her early 50s, a physician herself, and she carried a letter her father had written shortly before his death. With trembling hands, she read, "To the Jackson family, if you're reading this, then you found what I buried and perhaps begun the fight I was too afraid to finish while alive. I want you to know that your son and brother fought heroically against forces determined to destroy him. Every day he resisted was a victory, though the world saw only the moments when he stumbled. I documented his struggle not to profit from it, but to preserve the truth for a day when it might matter. Michael believed the truth always rises, no matter how deep it's buried. He was right. I pray that justice finally catches up to those who wronged him, and that no other artist suffers as he did. Your loving son died a warrior, not a victim. Make sure the world knows that." There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering. Katherine Jackson, now frail but resolute at 99 years old, embraced Rachel Kleinberg. Two families, bound together by tragedy and a shared commitment to truth, stood united. The crowd sang "Heal the World" as the sun set over Forest Lawn, their voices carrying across the grounds where Michael Jackson's physical form rested but where his spirit and his vindication now soared free. The story that had begun with a mysterious depression in the ground had transformed into a movement that had reshaped an industry and saved countless lives. The vault beneath Forest Lawn had contained more than documents and photographs. It had contained the courage to speak truth to power, the love that survives death, and the hope that justice, though delayed, could still prevail. What they found under Michael Jackson's grave had indeed changed everything, not just for his family or his legacy, but for every artist who would come after him, every dreamer who would dare to share their gift with the world. The King of Pop's final performance wasn't a concert. It was a reckoning that echoed across the industry he transformed, ensuring that his death would save lives rather than simply end one. And somewhere in the California earth, where Kleinberg's vault had once lain hidden, the ground remained stable, its secrets finally released, its truth finally heard, its purpose finally fulfilled.